Hello, Mates Rife Nation. I've waited a long time for this guest, but it's well worth the wait. In fact, my dopamine has been rising as this interview has been coming up. And so it's an honor and a privilege to be talking about dopamine hits, dopamine fast, dopamine detox, dopamine balance with the professor of psychiatry from the School of Stanford Medicine. And she's part of the chief, I think, clinic with regards to addiction. Very, very well known all over the world, and written a brilliant book called Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. I'm going to try and get every single bit of energy from her and laugh from her because she's a real health hero in the space, and I've learned so much from her. So welcome to the show, Dr. Anna Lembke.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that very warm introduction. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm fascinated with dopamine. I think everyone is. Everyone thinks you click on Facebook and there's a like, and then you get a dopamine hit. And I don't think there's a good understanding. But I really want to ask this very important question: why you wrote this book called Dopamine Nation?
I was trying to communicate the message that we live in a drugified world where almost every aspect of human behavior and consumption has been made more reinforcing, more novel, more accessible, more bountiful, such that we've all become vulnerable to the problem of addiction. And that means that we've also become more vulnerable to the problem of anxiety, depression, inattention, insomnia, etc. Because, of course, addiction is the great mimic, and the downstream effect of addictive compulsive overconsumption of any drug, and I use the term drug very broadly here to encompass behaviors as well as food, ultra-processed food in particular. The downstream effect is mental health sequelae.
And we've seen that, just sharing offline with you, that 50% of corporate Johannesburg is on an antidepressant. And I'm not anti-Western medicine. I've been a physician for 25 years. I've seen over 140,000 consults in the practice. But there's got to be different ways that we address this mental ill health epidemic, in my view, and just mental performance that is plummeting at such a rapid rate. And that's why we're going to be doing a series with a few psychiatrists, some of your own colleagues overseas in the US and some colleagues here in South Africa. But let's talk about my own addiction. I don't like to use the word I am an addict to have identity with that, although I've learned a lot from internal family systems. I think that's been a breakthrough for me in the last year, because we have so many different parts of ours. But, I'm really addicted to researching and lecture to over 12,000 medical professionals worldwide. And, I've read 31 books in the last 12 months. And every single minute, if I'm in the car and I got a 3-minute trip, I'll spend 2 minutes to try and find a podcast to listen to so that I get that information. And so I'm really addicted to learning. And this is my go-to. And then when I get the learning and the insights to share it, I get this massive dopamine hit. So I've got my own story there. Is everyone addicted to something in this really overstimulated, there's too much indulgence world that we have?
Great question. Addiction, broadly defined, is the continued compulsive use of a substance or a behavior despite harm to self and or others. In general, when we think about learning, although it does cause the release of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, which is why it feels good to many people, we haven't traditionally thought of that as something that's addictive. We think of that as healthy, as adaptive, as strengthening us in so many ways. When I use the word addiction, I am specifically speaking to a form of psychopathology. So without knowing you better, it would be really hard for me to say whether or not I would use the term addiction in your case as just described to me now. Not necessarily. It sounds like it could just be a passion or something you're really invested in, but perhaps given more time to discuss it in depth, I would come to know that your obsession with learning and communicating that knowledge is impacting your personal relationships, is impacting your self-care, is in other ways interfering with you having, the kind of life that you want and need to be a thriving human. So I want to put it out there. I also want to say that what's amazing about the time that we live in now is that even what we typically and traditionally have thought of as healthy and adaptive behaviors like making human connection, learning, doing work that contributes to the world. Even those very good and healthy things have become drugified. How? They've been made more potent by being social media or connecting them to social media, hence connecting them to the potential for dollars and fame. They become more accessible. So work, for example, has no limit, has no end. We can access it 24/7 wherever we are. Information overload. It's, again, become more novel. You learn one thing and immediately you want to learn another thing, and you can access it right away. So it's an acceleration of that learning process without any pauses that are so necessary for us to kind of reset the reward, get back to kind of baseline levels as we think of this baseline dopamine levels. So it's important to acknowledge that even healthy stuff has become unhealthy in the modern ecosystem.
So it's not actually the actual object or, Netflix or exercise or learning or food. It's the abuse of that behavior or that object or that situation that then causes
well, it is the object. So the point is that all of these objects have been turned into drugs, right? We have bioengineered them through the technology and through our supply chain and many other factors to be more accessible, more potent, more novel, and more bountiful. I mean, think about TikTok. TikTok literally never runs out. If you had a world in which cocaine literally never ran out, we would have a much bigger cocaine problem than we do. And we already have a big cocaine problem.
But Dr. Anna, is it not the dose then that's important? Because if you're on, say, Instagram or social media, we'll talk about that at the end, but you use it to a far lesser degree that doesn't impact areas or doesn't reset your dopamine balance, then it's not causing any sort of problem with your dopamine reset.
Right. So what we can infer based on animal models and clinical experience is that if you use intoxicants in moderation and leave enough time in between use to reset those reward pathways, you are less likely to develop that addiction phenotype. And there are also interesting animal studies showing, for example, if you expose a rat to a lever to press a lever to get intravenous cocaine, and you expose them to that lever press for 1 hour a day, what you find is that over successive days, they have the same rate of lever press. So there's not an increase in the rate over successive days. But if you expose them to cocaine for 6 hours a day, which is essentially all day long, what you find is that over consecutive days, they press the lever faster and faster and faster, ultimately till exhaustion or death. So we are dealing with something, at least when it comes to a stimulant like cocaine, where hypothetically, if there's enough time in between, maybe it's possible to use something like cocaine in moderation. I am not espousing or endorsing to anybody out there to use cocaine in any amount. My point is just that the neuroscience really speaks to all of these rewarding substances and behaviors working on the same common pathway. Whatever the chemical cascade is, the final common pathway is to release dopamine in that reward pathway. The more dopamine that's released, the more reinforcing that substance or behavior is for a given individual. And then most importantly, what starts out as being salient or releasing a lot of dopamine for that individual with repeated exposure ultimately releases less and less dopamine and causes a dopamine deficit state where now what we have is what George Koob calls dysphoria-driven relapse. The main driver of our compulsive overuse is not to feel pleasure or solve the problem that we initially set out to solve, but really just to get out of this dopamine hole and feel normal.
Yeah, that's an important point there, because there's so many different parts of our lives that can give us dopamine, whether it's social media or exercise or food. So let's take my life. What I look forward to, the most in the morning is if I wake up with my wife, married, 24 years, and then we have an intimate time. And then I really look forward to going to the gym and listening to a podcast or an audio book or reading something, or going outside. So that's exercise. That's another dopamine hit. Then I get into the sauna. It's one of my favorite places. And then I have a cold shower afterwards. And so, and then I have some food, and then that's a dopamine. And like Just thinking of
Right.
it now, it's like, that's my favorite morning. If I could wake up every day and have a morning like that with my exercise, my sauna, and the harder the sauna is and the more pleasurable the cold shower is and the better the breakfast is afterwards, I suppose that's just dopamine now, hits upon hits upon hits upon hits. Is that the problem that we're having?
So again, want to really emphasize that if your favorite morning is still working for you and not interfering with other aspects of your life, then I would not call that addiction. I would call that, you know, what we were wired for over millions of years of evolution, which is to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And we live these very long lives now where we tinker with what we do to try to optimize the things that feel good, minimize the things that feel bad, right? The problem is, again, that our ability to micro control all of these little dopamine hits in all of these different ways. And so to answer your question, yes, we're getting our dopamine from all of these different sources. And it's almost like the dopamine stacking, you know, hypothetically, we're using dopamine somewhat metaphorically here. It's the stacking of all of that that's then conspiring together to work as one very potent drug that ultimately may be driving down our baseline dopamine production to compensate for the fire hose of dopamine we're getting in all these different ways, which you elaborate on, which might ultimately mean that one of the reasons so many people living in modern wealthy countries where they have the leisure and the ability to control and manage and organize their lives around these rewards, one of the reasons that people may be experiencing so much ennui, anxiety, despair, sense of sort of not feeling joy in their lives is precisely because we've messed up our basic dopamine physiology by constantly engineering these little hits of dopamine.
I guess the question is, when I don't have a morning like that, then I don't feel nearly as good. I almost feel a bit down and don't feel as stimulated. My brain's not as sharp. I don't feel as focused. I'm not looking forward to the day. You know, I almost feel indestructible after a morning like that. You know, there's a spring in my step. You know, I feel strong, lean, especially after that intense sort of pain in the sauna. You know, I pushed it today like 20, 25 minutes. And the last 5-10 minutes was exceptionally almost painful. My heart rate went up to like 130, 140. And then I got into this cold shower. And then afterwards, I just felt incredible. Now, if I'm not having a morning like that, then my level's a lot lower. I wake up and I don't have that energy and sense of well-being for the day.
All right. So, Steve, based on that, I would not say that your behaviors are an addiction. They sound, first of all, you're primarily getting your dopamine indirectly by doing things that are painful or difficult. And that is a way to get dopamine. People can get addicted to things like saunas and exercise, but generally it's harder to do that because you're not actually going into that dopamine deficit state that drives that craving and reuse. It takes effort to do these difficult activities. Most people have some resistance to entering them, but then feel better afterwards. And you're clearly saying that you have your whole morning jamboree, so to speak, because when you're done, you feel better and you've experimented with it and you consistently see. So it seems to me that you've been able to leverage your reward system primarily by doing things that are painful and hard. And I use this metaphor of a pleasure-pain balance to talk about how doing things that are painful and hard is actually a pretty good way of leveraging this dopamine system to get it afterward, as opposed to intoxicants, where we get that spike of dopamine initially with intoxicants, followed by dopamine free fall levels, not just to baseline, but below baseline into that dopamine deficit state where we're craving. That's what gets us into this addiction vortex. What you're doing is paying for your dopamine up front. That means you're not getting a dopamine spike. You're getting gradual increases in dopamine over the latter half of exercise or other painful activities. And then once you come out of the sauna or you stop exercising, dopamine levels remain elevated for hours afterwards before going back to the baseline level position. That is, you're not going into this dopamine deficit state. And that's a pretty good way of getting dopamine and feeling good. And we all want to feel good. So over millions of years of evolution, we are reflexively designed to approach pleasure and avoid pain. We do that unconsciously. An infant child will pull their heel away from a pinprick on the heel and turn naturally to a mother's breast. That's not something they need to be taught, right? And then over the course of our lives interacting with the environment, we're constantly tinkering with this felt good, this didn't feel good. So again, if you're not finding that your morning jamboree is causing distress with your health, you're not staying in the sauna till you're burned, you're not exercising till you're injured. We see those people, right? And you're not using so much time doing those things that you have serious opportunity costs, like other things that you should be doing or you want to be doing, like spending time with friends and family, then I would not say that you have an addiction. And also maybe you're not telling me you're not depressed, you're not anxious. So I'm sensing that you found a kind of a good equilibrium.
So maybe the difference is if you work hard, if there's pain and then you get dopamine, that's what you want. So if you work a hard day and then you've got the finance to have a nice meal, that's going to be far better because you actually have to put the effort in. But if you're a multimillionaire and the food gets delivered and it's so easy and you're eating, or you just get onto social media and you just press a button, or you get onto Netflix, there's no work involved. There's no sacrifice to build up to that. It's just instantaneous, like a drug or cocaine or psychedelic. It's straight away, it hits you without that pain process in place.
Right, exactly. So again, what is an intoxicant? An intoxicant is something that releases a lot of dopamine all at once in the reward pathway, more than our brains were evolved to tolerate. If you think about the environment that our brains evolved in, they evolved in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, where we would have to walk tens of kilometers every day for a tiny little bit of water, tiny little bit of food, maybe the occasional new human being, right? Now we're living in this world of overwhelming overabundance. But bottom line, an intoxicant releases a lot of dopamine all at once. Our brain is reeling to try to compensate, does that by downregulating dopamine transmission, involuting postsynaptic dopamine receptors, not just to baseline, below baseline. And then with repeated exposure, that thing that was initially salient is no longer salient. But that after effect, the dopamine deficit state is stronger and longer, and we kind of get stuck in that state. And now we're depressed, we're anxious, we're irritable, we can't sleep, and we're craving, right? We have a narrowing of our focus. We're constantly thinking about using our drug of choice. I do want to, though, highlight, you said one thing that I think we need to think about and be cautious about, which is what I call the work hard, play hard mentality, which is also very common today, especially among successful professionals, where, yes, they're doing hard things all day long, but they're not doing things that give them that natural dopamine reward. It's a different kind of stress that then actually increases craving for intoxicants. So they get to the end of the day and then they go home and they drink or they smoke or, they use or they binge on Netflix or pornography, video games. That is very bad for our brains, because now we're tweaking it on the pain side and tweaking it on the pleasure side and getting into this serious seesaw effect, which is essentially, an enormous literal physiologic stressor, because every time our brain has to work to try to restore homeostasis or baseline levels of dopamine firing, we release adrenaline, right? We have a cortisol, a stress response. So now you've got this work hard, play hard thing where the whole day is arranged around sort of intense sacrifice, then followed by intense reward. Very confusing for our brains.
So the sacrifice is too much, and then the reward is too much. So the level's swinging too high. It's not incremental changes. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. One of the ways to think about this is a metaphor that I use, which is like a seesaw or a teeter-totter, which represents how we process pleasure and pain. One of the important findings in neuroscience is that pleasure and pain are actually co-located in the brain and work like opposite sides of a balance. When we do something pleasurable, the balance tips one way, pain, it tips the other. But there are rules governing this balance. The first and most important is that it wants to remain level, or what we call homeostasis. This is baseline levels of dopamine firing. We're always releasing dopamine at a kind of baseline tonic level. How does our brain return to homeostasis? first by tilting an equal and opposite amount to whatever the stimulus was. So we use an intoxicant that releases dopamine, the balance tilts to the side of pleasure. The brain then adapts by downregulating dopamine transmission. Like you can think of that as these neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as it's level. They stay on until it's tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. That's craving, wanting. If we use, again, to try to restore the level balance, what happens over time with repeated exposure is that initial release of dopamine gets weaker and shorter in duration. So that tip to the side of pleasure gets weaker and shorter, but the after response to the pain side gets stronger and longer. In other words, those gremlins multiply. They turn into Arnold Schwarzenegger gremlins. And if we then continue to expose our brain to intoxicants over longer periods of time, we eventually end up with enough gremlins to fill this whole room. They're camped out on the pain side of the balance. Now we've entered addicted brain. We've changed our hedonic or joy set point. Now we need to use in more potent forms and in larger amounts, not to get high and feel good, but just to counteract those gremlins and level the balance. And when we're not using, importantly, we are experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance: anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and craving. So when I make a therapeutic intervention now for anxiety, insomnia, depression, or cravings, not everybody comes in looking for help with those behaviors. They're coming in for depression or anxiety. One of the first things that I will do is I recommend a period of abstinence of about 4 weeks from their drug of choice to give enough time for those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for homeostasis to be restored. And in about 80% of all comers, when we do that, people initially feel worse before they feel better, right? Because you're taking the reward off the pleasure side, you're slamming it down to the pain side. But eventually the gremlins get the message, they hop off the balance. And by weeks 3 and 4 of that dopamine fast, patients feel a whole lot better. Not just better than they did in the first 2 weeks, better than they have in a really long time. The other thing we recommend to them is that they intentionally press on the pain side of the balance by doing things that are hard: exercise, ice cold water bath, sauna, some cases just walking in the neighborhood because people are very sedentary. And by intentionally pressing on the pain side, we get those gremlins to change their allegiance, go to the pleasure side, and we get our dopamine indirectly by paying for it up front. But again, we're not talking about extreme forms of pain like self-cutting or excessive stressful working and sleep deprivation, not things like that. It's mild stressors, exercise, intermittent fasting to a degree, ice cold water immersion, things like that.
Okay, so I'm going to summarize. There's a seesaw, there are gremlins on the side, that you start stacking the more you use things that increase dopamine, and then what happens, you get out of balance. And then if you carry on using, you don't wait, you increase those gremlins on the wrong side. And that causes a significant problem because you're in a dopamine deficit. And you can be diagnosed with depression or anxiety or cognitive decline or lack of performance. So now that we're talking about that, you have answered it, but I just want to directly speak this question to those corporate leaders that we see, those executives and managers, business owners and entrepreneurs. I've got Dr. Anna Lembke here, and she's a professor of psychiatry. She's part and heads up, I think, the chief addiction center at Stanford. And so she's written a book called Dopamine Nation. And it's really finding balance in the age of indulgence, because we just live in an indulgent world. And so we're going to go through an archetype or an avatar of someone who comes to you with anxiety, and they're often a high achiever. Those are the people we're seeing, having done functional medicine for now 17 years. These people often come to me and they're on an antidepressant or they're on an SSRI, and they're really struggling and they're not coping and starting to affect their performance at life, in life in general. So take us through your process of someone who comes through with chronic anxiety. And I know it's difficult because every patient is unique and you need to look at many, many factors. But just because I think you've got a different way of looking and treating at these patients, how can someone use sort of your understanding of dopamine and getting the book to help them with anxiety?
Yeah, so broadly speaking, just to emphasize the areas in which this approach is novel or countercultural, what I'm basically saying is that we evolved over millions of years of evolution to do things that are hard. We really are wired for pain. And I believe that at least a partial contributor to our current mental health crisis is that things are actually too easy for us, that the world is too convenient, that we are too sedentary, that we are not in our bodies, and that we are in our heads in a very stressful way. So the intervention is countercultural because instead of saying, I'm going to intervene and suggest some things you can do to make yourself more comfortable in the short term, instead, I'm going to intervene and suggest that you actually make yourself more uncomfortable. So instead of saying making yourself more comfortable in the short term, I'm going to ask that you make yourself more uncomfortable in the short term, with the idea being that that will actually make you more comfortable, less anxious down the road. And this is based on the neuroscience of how we process pleasure and pain. And the fact that those two are in relation to each other and relative, right? It's the theory of relativity of pleasure and pain. So if I have a patient who comes to me and their chief complaint is anxiety, of course, I will explore it in its many different forms. But what I will also explore is the role of highly reinforcing substances and behaviors in their lives. I'll include, of course, traditional drugs and alcohol, but I will also ask about how much time are you spending online? What are you doing online? How much pornography? How much video games? How much just watching TikTok and YouTube videos, which we know are highly potent digital drugs that work on the same reward pathway as drugs and alcohol. And in that exploration, just gathering data, what are you using, how much and how often, not only do I discover, their habits or behaviors, but they see them often for the first time. Because again, when we're chasing dopamine, we often lose the ability to be aware of our behaviors. So it becomes real to them. I talk about, why do you use? I talk about problems related to use. And then I essentially invite them to do an experiment. And it is a genuine experiment because I don't know the outcome. And it's something we'll both learn from, but the hypothesis that the experiment is based on is, hey, you're depressed and anxious. You're telling me that, watching YouTube videos or smoking pot is the only thing that relaxes you at the end of the day. My hypothesis is that although that may have been initially effective, that now what you're doing is basically just exacerbating or creating anxiety through that behavior, accumulating gremlins on the pain side of the balance. And the only way we can find out is to do an experiment and have you abstain for long enough for those gremlins to hop off, for homeostasis to be restored, and for us to see what is underneath. And I always warn patients that they will feel worse before they feel better. This is absolutely critical. If I miss that step, they're not going to be successful because they're going to go into withdrawal. They're going to feel like crap. Anxiety, depression, inattention, cognitive function will all be worse. And they'll say, that was wrong. And I'm clearly needing this substance or behavior to self-medicate. So I say to them, what you're feeling is withdrawal mediated. If you can just wait long enough and get past that first 10 to 14 days, a window will open and you will start to feel better, not just better than you did in acute withdrawal, but better maybe than you have in a long time. And if they're willing and able to then engage in that experiment, and we plot out exactly what that looks like. So if it's a digital media, they can't obviously get off screens altogether, but it might be like, I'm going to delete Twitter, or I'm going to delete my pornography sites, or I'm going to block myself from sports betting, or I'm going to throw away my pot and not use it. And, whatever, sometimes we use medications to help with appetitive control, mutual help meetings, although people are usually resistant to that initially. Lots of different things. Hormesis, which is to, when you get a craving, intentionally do something that's more painful than the craving to help you get through the craving, but also mindfulness, urge surfing, all of that. When people come back 4 weeks later in my clinical experience, and also supported by the clinical literature, about 80% of people feel better. And it's a real aha moment. It's like, oh my goodness, either I thought this substance or behavior was helping my anxiety, or I thought there was no relationship between this substance or behavior and my anxiety. And now that I'm not doing it and I feel so much better, I realize that that substance or behavior was fueling this feeling. And I'm feeling much, much better. Now, is a month enough for all comers? No, it's not. Some people with severe addiction, especially if they've had multiple relapses, will need many more months to really reset reward pathways. Some people may have a broken balance and never actually get there. We may need to use medications, but the medications will be much more effective if they're not engaging in the addictive behavior. Some people may not feel better after this exercise. That's important information. Okay, it's not this behavior. There's something else going on. Let's explore further. Some people may not have been able to do it. And then it's okay, do you want to recommit to doing it? Why didn't you want to do it? Let's explore that further. Are you in fact actually not able to willfully control this behavior? Do you need a higher level of care? Do you need to go to an addiction treatment facility where you don't have access? So it's just an enormous amount of information that you get from it, which then you can use to inform future actions. And I really like it because so much of what we do in psychotherapy and psychiatry is talk about emotions and talk about feelings. What we're doing here is we're actually changing a variable in the biological system, stressing the system to see what is true cause and effect here. And it's really, really rich because when people do feel better after this dopamine fast, they are so motivated to make a change in the behavior. I no longer need to persuade them of the value. They're like, oh my goodness, this is clearly having an impact. Let me also emphasize there, after 4 weeks, we do a kind of pros and cons list. What was good about not using? We often hear less anxious, less depressed, more cognitively with it, better able to concentrate, more present, more productive, doing more quality work, right? Because I'm not spending my whole time waiting till this moment is over so I can use. On the cons list, what do we hear? Couldn't socialize, because that's how I socialize with friends. Also, boredom. Boredom is such a big reason for addictive behaviors and also relapse. I had all of a sudden all this time. I was thinking all these thoughts. It was kind of scary. I didn't know what to do with myself. So great opportunity to talk about, well, yeah, what do you do with those thoughts and feelings, and where does it, where does it take you, and what thoughts came up? And then we make a plan for going forward. So I also want to emphasize that most people in our clinic, first time around, who are able to do this dopamine fast for 4 weeks, most of them, even when they feel better, want to go back to using, right? It's not like everyone's like, aha, I've seen the light. I never want to use pornography again. It's like, no, I'd kind of like to go back to doing that, but I want to use less. I want to use differently, right? So then we make a very specific plan for what that will look like. It's a plan for moderation, as well as what are the red flags that you're deviating from that. And it's really interesting to see what people do. Some people are able to moderate. Some people immediately, with first encounter of reuse, have what's called the abstinence violation syndrome and are on a bender. Some people initially are able to manage their consumption, but slowly drift over time. Some people who are able or even partially able say, it's really not worth it because using less doesn't really get me what I want, and it just triggers more craving. So actually, I'm going to choose abstinence because it's easier. So anyway, it's all over the map, but it's a very interesting, personal experiment.
Sure, there's a lot there, but how do you rank the different, someone, I'm just thinking, okay, let's take the anxiety corporate or business owner, they're taking an SSRI, they get home, they have a drink, an alcoholic drink, then they have, some junk food, or they have some crisps, or they get home, then they have dinner, then they watch Netflix, then they might do a bit of pornography. Do you rank these? Do you have a very, very good assessment to say, hang on, well, you need to reduce these or stop these, because now you're taking away a lot of things, which is very counter sort of intuitive to the medical model that says, I'll give you a pill, I'm going to give you something to deal with the anxiety.
Yeah, great question. So, there's this sort of notion of the Silicon Valley dopamine fast where the, tech bro goes into a dark cave for a week and then emerges and looks at a leaf and feels euphoria. That's not what we're doing clinically. I mean, it's the same neuroscientific principle. I'm not disparaging it. It comes from the same need and the same sense of being sort of physiologically out of balance with the environment that we live in now. But what we do clinically is we really try to identify what is the substance or behavior that is problematic, that has these signs and symptoms of addiction. Things we talk about, the 4 C's: out of control use, compulsive use, cravings, continued use despite consequences, as well as the T and the W, tolerance and withdrawal. Tolerance is needing more over time to get the same effect, like going from vanilla toast pornography to maybe even, child pornography those are the kinds of progressions that we see as people get in this addiction loop. And that's we see that as part of tolerance rather than like as a paraphilia per se. And then withdrawal. When I stop, I feel worse. So the 4 C's, tolerance and withdrawal, we look for those, and then we ask them to really focus. We want them to have a sense of, competency around it. And we find that even if they have other sort of behaviors, usually there's 1 or maybe 2 really problematic ones, especially if they're linked together. Like every time I drink, I want a cigarette. We might then say, let's give up the alcohol and the cigarette at the same time. But not like every single pleasurable thing that they do if it's not problematic. But we also warn them about what's called cross addiction, which is the tendency to, as we give up one a maladaptive substance or behavior, to replace it with another. So I've got patients who, for example, trying to quit smoking cigarettes, but don't want to give up their nightly pot use. The big warning is, okay, well, as we try to stop cigarettes, you don't want to then start smoking more pot. So be vigilant about that. What we find clinically, which is slightly, counterintuitive, is that even if they continue with another addictive substance or behavior, the dopamine fast from even that one can lead to these improvements in psychological well-being, a kind of what we are, metaphorically calling resetting the reward pathways. So that, people can see real benefit, especially if there's very clearly one substance or one behavior that's super problematic for them. That's the one we focus on. That's the one we try to give them traction on. We're seeing improvements in self-efficacy, decreasing in craving, improvements in mood, anxiety, cognition, sleep. And then very often people want to tackle the next one, right? Which is great. And then we work with them. So for example, this is where food addiction has really come up a lot in our clinic now. Folks who are struggling with cannabis use disorder and alcohol use disorder are able to either achieve abstinence or moderation of those substances and then realize, oh, I have this tendency with food. And I'm like, I want to work on that too. So that's really exciting, as well as familial contagion. Like as one person, because it's hard to do this alone. So as one person starts to get into recovery around compulsive overuse, other family members are often interested in joining that person. And if they're not interested in helping, that's important, family systems. So you talked about internal family systems, but actually addiction is a family systems problem as well. So then talking about family systems, I do want to jump in and say that SSRIs are interesting on a number of levels. First of all, I use them all the time. I'm grateful for them as an important tool. But SSRIs can actually increase cravings for carbohydrates and alcohol in some people. So one of the reasons that I like to do this intervention in a depressed person, and a person with an alcohol use disorder before I go to SSRIs is because if I jump in with an SSRI, I might actually increase their cravings for alcohol. Not to mention the fact that, again, I've found that doing this fasting from things like alcohol alone can often improve people's mood and anxiety without my having to go to a medication. But for folks who are already on an SSRI, one thing to think about, and there are published case reports on this, I've seen cases in my own career, the possibility that drinking has actually gotten worse as a result of the SSRI, or binge eating has gotten worse as a result of the SSRI.
Okay. Sure, a lot to unpack there, but do you use health coaches or do you recommend someone goes out of the environment? I'm just thinking of a lot of these corporates and business owners that are in a very distressful environment, and we've had to reframe stress as being neutral, and there's the eustress and the distress because people don't understand how beneficial stress is, and this adrenaline cortisol that gets released, it just helps us thrive and overcome obstacles and grow and develop. But how do you facilitate that in the beginning? I'm just thinking, like, now I've got to tell someone to take a dopamine fast. They're in the same environment. If they don't change the environment, or they don't have a health coach, we use a lot of health coaches. Then you get this trigger. If I think of super communicators who wrote The Power of Habit, Charles Duhigg, as well as Atomic Habits, these triggers or cues, and then you get the behavior and you get the reward. How do you facilitate that initial period? Because I can just imagine how tough that must be.
Yeah, great point. And my practice has changed over the years to where I will have, depending upon the person, a lot of conversations educating them about the neuroscience and what might be happening, building that therapeutic alliance before I actually ask them to do the dopamine fast. Or I might introduce the concept early on, but then we might prepare for it. What does preparation look like? Well, just kind of psychologically gearing up for it, planning how you're going to engage in what I call self-binding strategies. That is to say, creating an environment that is optimal for making this behavior change, engaging with, life coaches, therapists, mutual help groups. For example, there are now 12-step groups online for Internet and Technology Addicts Anonymous, for people who are struggling with digital drugs. Everybody knows there's Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics. Now, those are organizations for people who self-identify as having addiction, whose goal is to abstain, so may not be appropriate for all comers who are just wanting to experiment with the impact of what the substance is in their lives. But nonetheless, good for them to know. There are also many other online communities where people promote each other in moderation as a goal. So that's been a really new wave that accelerated during COVID. We have a group in our clinic, for example, where people can come with different goals and get support, whether it's abstinence or moderation. But yes, the point being, very hard to change behavior in the same environment. So giving time to put the pieces in place to optimize success is always a good idea.
Would you want to add anything to your protocol with regards to cognitive decline or lack of cognitive performance? We've seen a major change there in terms of people's cognitive ability, especially in the corporate space and entrepreneurial space. People just don't have the performance, and some significant objective measurements and tests have shown this. Is there anything else that you would like to add there? A lot of complaints of brain fog, waking up in the morning, just not unable to, complete the task that they'd like to, or the inability to concentrate and focus over time.
Yeah, I mean, cognitive decline or cognitive fogginess has overlaps with so many other disorders. We know that when people are depressed, they can be cognitively clouded and not processing. We know that when people are anxious, they often can't attend to what's happening because of their anxiety, which means then they can't, even take in the information to process it. So, and because these high reward substances and behaviors, again, ultimately lead to this dopamine deficit state that's characterized by anxiety, inattention, insomnia, depression, craving. Very often people get a ton of cognitive clarity, when they do the dopamine fast. Now, importantly, it gets worse before it gets better. So I've had patients, for example, trying to give up cigarettes, driving through red lights because they just simply cannot pay attention, or even trying to reduce their stimulant dose. Let's take their stimulants for ADHD, or maybe they're using methamphetamine or whatever. Sedatives, hypnotics, Xanax, alcohol, all of that is hugely cognitively clouding for people. So again, giving it up for a period of time to kind of reset reward pathways can be really amazing in terms of cognitive clarity. I've had older patients who were really looking like they met criteria for Alzheimer's, who then gave up alcohol or benzodiazepines or what have you, and got an amazing amount of cognitive clarity back. And it's also just useful because if the cognitive clarity doesn't come back, it's then more information to say, gee, maybe we need to pursue a larger differential diagnosis and some other potential causes.
Okay, do you teach a program? I'm just thinking from a practicality point of view. Someone's on, an SSRI, or they're on a sleeping tablet, or they're really struggling. Now, all of a sudden, you're saying a dopamine fast. You want to look at your dopamine levels. You're getting too many dopamine hits. You're overstimulated. Let's go on a retreat for a week. Is there any way to sort of take this process? Is there an online process? Do you teach health coaches? How can you facilitate this practically within this new world that unfortunately is just from a stimulation point of view so pervasive and so pernicious that people are probably unaware of the importance of your work and the importance of your book, because it sounds like all you're doing is withdrawing all their pleasures away, and they're like, hey, I can't go down that road. This is the only thing that's helping me. Meanwhile, it's actually the biggest problem. How do we translate this into, say, even South Africa or into Africa?
Yeah, gosh, thanks for asking. So we are coming out in October of this year with something called the official Dopamine Nation workbook. We've had to put the word official there because there have been these fake knockoffs called with Dopamine Nation workbook with my name on them, but I didn't have anything to do with them. And I understand that they're not quality publications. But this Dopamine Nation workbook is based on the principles in the book Dopamine Nation. And it's really a step-by-step approach that people can do on their own or together with their therapist or their life coach to sort of walk them through to prepare for this dopamine fast, to gather all the data, to think about it, to learn about how the brain works, a lot of interactive exercises. So I mean, I hope that will help folks who really want a practical guide.
Do you have an online assessment to say, listen, hang on, someone like myself, well, I'm actually addicted to exercise. When I don't get it, it affects these parts of my life, my relationships, my work. Is there any way to get an objective assessment score from someone like Dr. Anna?
No, but feel free, Steve. If you want to make it up, go for it. I give you free rein.
I'm going to need your help there, Dr. Anna. Just being in Africa, you know, I've done a lot of studies in the US over the last 25 years, and this is, I love the people in Fort Lauderdale, but when I've done conferences there and we've stayed at these fancy hotels, and I was part of the American Association of Orthopedic Medicine for many years, but it seemed like they, with all the money in the world, were the sort of unhappiest, just the most complaining people I've ever come across. And then going into Africa and in some really tricky parts of Johannesburg in this country where they don't have much and they're living in a corrugated iron shack and they don't have running water and they got limited electricity, and yet they got the biggest smiles on the face, they got contentment, they've got each other, they're pushing into each other from a community aspect. We saw this with COVID. I mean, they thought COVID was going to run rife in these, you know, these shack towns and what we call townships here in South Africa. It didn't. It was the least amount of sort of deaths in these areas or morbidity in these areas. It was incredible. And, you know, and we're not talking about typhoid and is a real problem, and dysentery is a real problem in this country. So sanitation is a real issue. But COVID didn't, and they had the least amount of issues there. But it seems like they are smiling. They often have to get a taxi at 4 o'clock in the morning. You know, we got domestic help here, significant amount of domestic help at my practice and at the house. But they seem a lot happier. They seem a lot more content than people who've got all these resources and are very, very wealthy and are very unhappy. I mean, how do we sort of marry that in this crazy world?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. So this is something that I've called the plenty paradox. We have more and more data showing that the people living in the wealthiest nations in the world are the unhappiest people. And that, right, although rates of depression and anxiety and in some countries suicide are rising all over the world, they're rising fastest in the wealthiest nations. And these are also the nations that have the most access to modern mental health treatment, the same nations where we're prescribing the most antidepressants, the most anxiolytics, the most mood stabilizers, the most antipsychotics, which really does suggest that plenty itself or overabundance is a human stressor. Again, we evolved for a world of scarcity. We are now living in a world of plenty. Our basic evolutionarily conserved physiology for approaching pleasure and avoiding pain was not designed for the world that we live in now. And as a result, we are coping poorly. And that, in fact, you know, of course, living in extreme poverty is a huge stressor. There's no doubt about it. But living in extreme plenty turns out, in my opinion, also to be a huge stressor. And I think the most vulnerable populations in the world are poor people living in rich nations because they have a lot of access to these, you know, high potency, feel good substances and behaviors without having equal access to the kinds of, you know, let's say healthy sources of dopamine, clean air, you know, nutritious food, etc. So yeah, it is really, really fascinating how that level of wealth does not necessarily make people happier and may be directly contributing to mental health issues. And I want to emphasize it's probably happening on a physiologic level. So by constantly making ourselves comfortable, doing the thing that's convenient and quick and easy, using our big brains to control and modulate how we feel and to fine tune those good feelings and avoid those bad feelings, basically grinds us down to this dopamine deficit state where now we're needing more potent forms over time, not to feel good, but just to stop feeling bad.
I know the parents of my community are going to ask me, I've got an 8-year-old daughter, I've got a 20-year-old son, and just looking at social media being a drug, what tips do you have for this next generation? Because it's so difficult. My son was the second last person out of his grade to get a phone. We tried to resist that as best as we could without sort of ostracizing him. And now my daughter at the age of 8, her friends in her class have got phones and they're on TikTok. I know that you're not a user of social media, so maybe you can just speak about social media and the next generation. What would you say to me as a father of an 8-year-old in a modern day city where we do have internet and we do have social media?
Yeah, so social media to me is a drug. It's a legal drug, and we see that phenomenologically. Most people who use social media will be able to correct their usage, just like most people who use alcohol do not become alcoholics. But a subset of individuals will very quickly manifest all the signs and symptoms of a full-blown addiction to social media. Just like we don't let kids, buy and consume alcohol in most countries, we shouldn't be doing that with social media. We absolutely need guardrails. And we can't expect individuals and their parents to take on the full responsibility for this. It has to be both a bottom-up and a top-down approach. This is a community problem. It's one thing to, deny your kid their phone and say, go out and play, and then they go out and play and no one else is there. There's no one to play with because they're all inside on social media. So this is a huge problem. It's one thing to, restrict it in the home, and then your kid goes to school and they're on a computer all day watching movies, that they've been assigned to watch or what have you. We have to really, really rethink what we've done here with social media, with the technology in general. Obviously, we're not going to throw the baby away with the bathwater, and there are many wonderful things about the technology, but we need a sophisticated digital etiquette informed by the science and the understanding that there is a deep, dark underbelly and that there are real harms, especially for vulnerable individuals, which I would say includes all kids, because kids still are developing their brains. Their frontal lobes are still not connected to those gremlins in the limbic and reward areas. And we cannot just give our kids, unmitigated access to devices and the internet. If you're talking about my specific recommendations, I would say to you, keep up the resistance, Steve. It's worth the fight. In general, I recommend that no child under the age of about 13 has a device with their own access to the internet, and that once they do get a device, that there's lots of discussions in the family about appropriate use, both what's socially appropriate in terms of quantity and frequency, what are the times and places when we're not to be using, not in the bedroom, not during meals, not during a social occasion when you're expected to interact and be humanly present for others, as well as, responsible use of digital media. You might have recently seen the New York Times article about sexploitation and how teenage boys are being lured into these, false sexual encounters with non-existent AI-generated teenage girls, and then, being persuaded to send dick pics and then being financially extorted because, of course, it never was a real girl on the other end. This is just absolutely terrible that we are not doing more as corporations, as governments, as societies to protect our kids from this. It's just, and that's, that's only, then you've got the whole addictive nature, the built-in design features that make these things inherently addictive, as we can all attest to and experience, right? So a lot of talking about as families, yeah, it's hard for me to disengage too, even from email, right? Just kind of that scrolling through, like waiting for something. I tell myself it's for work, it's productivity, I'm putting out fires. If I do more now, I'll do it. No, the faster I respond, the more emails I get. There has to be time in which we are offline. It has to be together in real life, all of us offline. We've created this powerful monster. We really have to cage it.
So profound for parents. Really go back and listen to that. I think every single parent needs to hear that, who's part of Mate to Tribe. But I just want to get a message of hope. I've been in practice 25 years. I've never seen anxiety to this degree. We started doing amino acid testing just to look at tyrosine and how important tyrosine is for dopamine, tryptophan important for serotonin, just because there's such a plethora of malnutrition and malillumination, and how important things are like the sun. Correct use, not abuse of the sun, but give a message of hope, because it's just when I look at the numbers and I just see who's been affected from very young now. I never used to see 7-year-olds and 8-year-olds, and we're trying to use a functional medicine approach and health coaches, and we've even got young health coaches to try and relate to individuals. But just leave people, because where are the numbers going? They're exponentially increasing. When I look at this, I don't have a lot of good news for corporate leaders and those people in influence that we're trying to really influence, because they've got the finances and the resources to really make changes. What is your view of the future of mental ill health and performance, and maybe a bit of hope for someone even like myself and the tribe at Made to Thrive?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm an optimist and also a pragmatist. I think humans have been around for so long because we're infinitely able to adapt. We now have to adapt to this ecosystem of overwhelming overabundance, which means that we can look to people in recovery from severe addictions as prophets for the rest of us. If they can survive in this ecosystem, so can the rest of us. And what a lot of people in recovery from addiction will tell you is that they're kind of glad they got addicted, because if they hadn't gotten addicted, they would have never gotten to recovery. And a life of recovery is so much richer and so much better than they feel like they would have had otherwise. So I think, what we haven't talked about is like the spiritual elements, the sense of meaning and purpose and community, but all of that, comes because we recognize when we start to go off the rails. I do think that addiction is the modern plague and will continue to be a huge public health problem for the foreseeable future. I'm talking centuries, because really we've taken care of survival. Like, we don't really have to do anything now in order to survive. So what the heck are we going to do with all of that leisure time and all of that expendable income? So far, what we're doing is playing a lot of video games, watching a lot of TikTok, and consuming a lot of pornography, pot, alcohol, and other drugs. I think everyone can recognize that's not going to get us where we want to go. So again, these discussions, I'm optimistic. It's going to take generations. My bigger concern is that I think that people who have access to education and wealth and other resources are going to get this message sooner and implement these tools sooner. And people who are disenfranchised, who are poor, who have access to leisure goods, but not to education and other resources, this is where I really think we're going to see a huge divide.
Okay, well, I want to declare favor and blessing over you, Dr. Anna Lembke. You are an absolute health legend. You are more than welcome to come stay in my home here in Johannesburg. We'd love to have you. We will send you on safari. We'll put it together. I've done over 208 episodes now of this podcast every single week for the last 4 years. And I really like to bless you. So I invite you warmly. We've got incredible and your dollar goes very far. So be welcomed here. We'd love to have you here and bless you.
Oh, thank you. That is so kind of you. I love your sort of upbeat spirit and your genuine desire to help others. I can feel that. And thank you for that kind invitation.